If you've ever lived with a man who weighs 1/7 of a ton, drinks beer like it was holy water, and thinks leaving his chair before noon is a mortal sin, you learn to recognize when the universe is about to play you dirty. The morning in question began like any other wolf thundering at Fritz about the exact shade of cream for his breakfast, me shuffling mail, and the orchids upstairs being coddled as if they were heirs to a fortune. Nothing new, nothing dramatic. Then came the Truffles. It wasn't the first time Wolfe had received food offerings. If a man spends years lecturing about cuisine in tones usually reserved for scripture, people send him edible tributes like pilgrims to a shrine. But this particular box of Perigord truffles had the kind of pedigree that could make a bishop envious. Packed in straw, wrapped with an Italian ribbon, and couriered with a note written in a hand, so neat you could use it for a geometry lesson, it looked less like groceries and more like a peace treaty. Wolfe grunted, slit the ribbon with a table knife, inhaled, and then closed his eyes. If he'd had the power, he would have canonized the fungus on the spot. "Archie," he said, "observe, the noblest of tubers, the earth itself distilled." He dabbed at one like it was fine porcelain. "To think men risk life and liberty for baubles when such glory is born beneath oak roots." I said, "If you're waiting for me to kiss it, I'll pass. Who sent them?" He handed me the note without looking. That told me two things. One, the sender mattered, and two, he already had an opinion about it. The note was short, Mr. Wolfe, a delicacy for your judgment. "I hope you will permit me to call upon you this afternoon. A matter of discretion and delicacy requires your wisdom." "Claudia Brentano," I whistled. Delicacy, discretion, and a crate of black diamonds. I'd say she knows her bait. Wolfe's lips pressed into what for him passed as animation. "Claudia Brentano," he said, the name swelling in the room like a dropped coin in a still pond. "An heiress, fabrics, shipping, and a vineyard in Piedmont. Her grandfather dealt in arms during the war. You left out that she's been on the society pages with 3 different husbands, none of whom kept her long enough to share a golden anniversary." "That," Wolfe said, "is gossip. Unworthy of notice." He picked up another truffle, rolled it in his palm, and muttered something in Latin that probably meant perfect. I leaned back. "So, are you opening the door, or should I tell Fritz to lock it?" "Phooey! A woman of her position does not appear unannounced. If she requests, she comes, and she did at precisely 4 o'clock, announced by the doorbell with the sort of determination that makes you expect either a process server or a cavalry charge. She came in wrapped in mink, with diamonds discreet enough to suggest wealth but not vulgarity, and eyes that had been trained to appraise men like she did wine-checking for age, depth, and the possibility of fraud. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, inclining her head the way queens do when they've already won the war. "I thank you for receiving me." Wolfe flicked a hand, which meant she could sit, speak, and hopefully avoid offending him. She chose the red chair. I took mine, notebook ready, though I already knew she'd give us more than words. She looked like a woman who'd brought trouble in her handbag. She began. "This is a matter that cannot leave these walls. I am being deceived, perhaps robbed, by someone very close to me. I have brought you the truffles as assurance that I respect your standards. If you accept me as a client, I will ask you to investigate not a murder, not a crime for the police, but a betrayal that could ruin me." Wolfe steepled his fingers, his eyelids lowered. That was his version of a drum roll. "Betrayal," he echoed. "Define it." She hesitated, which was my cue to study her. Her hands were steady, but her breath wasn't. She hadn't come for idle suspicion. She was already bleeding inside. "Someone," she said finally, "has tampered with my affairs. My family trust is under quiet attack. Papers have been altered, conversations overheard, and I hardly dare say items in my own home displaced in ways meant to unnerve me. I cannot go to the police. I cannot risk scandal. but if this continues, I will lose both money and standing." That was when Wolfe's eyebrows rose. Money was one thing, standing in society was another. When combined, they spelled a case worth his ears, if not his feet. "I see," he murmured. "And you expect me to expose this enemy without disturbing your high, did you phrase it?" "Delicacy?" She nodded. "Yes. My associates include men who would use this against me. I need discretion, precision. Justice without spectacle." I glanced at Wolfe. He hadn't said yes, but he hadn't said no, which meant I was in trouble. My evenings of quiet poker and decent beer were about to evaporate in a fog of rich suspects, fancy lies, and more headaches than aspirin can handle. Wolfe finally spoke. "Madam, you have disrupted my house with fungus, fragrance, and flattery. Very well. I will hear your account in full detail. Mr. Goodwin will document, and you will tell me the names of all who stand within this circle of suspicion." Her smile was quick, sharp, and not entirely grateful. She leaned forward. "There are 5. Her voice had the clarity of a bell that doesn't ring unless it expects to be heard. When she said, "There are 5," she didn't mean casual acquaintances. She meant suspects. The kind of list that Wolfe expects me to write down neatly while he sits back and decides which of them deserves his disfavor first. I flipped a page in my notebook and got my pen ready, though I had an idea she wasn't going to give us a string of cab drivers and bridge partners. "The first," Claudia said, "is my cousin, Anthony Brentano. He is younger by 10 years, but he has long felt cheated by our grandfather's will. He manages one of the vineyards in Piedmont, though the books, well, let us say, they may not bear scrutiny." "Noted," I said. "Cousin Anthony, suspicious books, check." Her eyes narrowed, and she almost smiled. "The second is my business partner in New York, Harold Merwin. A clever man, but clever men are often tempted to prove it at others' expense. He has access to my financial records, and I have reason to believe he has whispered things to competitors that only he could have known. Merwin, Harold, whisperer. Got it. The third," she continued, "is my secretary, Evelyn Shaw. She has been with me for 2 years. Too attentive, too careful. I have caught her reading letters she was not asked to read, handling papers she had no need to touch. I dismissed her twice, but she returned with apologies so polished that I allowed her to remain, perhaps foolishly." "Perhaps," Wolfe muttered, his voice like an avalanche, waiting for another snowflake. "The fourth," Claudia said, "is my lawyer, Simon Vardel. I hardly need to explain the power such a man has. His counsel is invaluable, but sometimes I wonder whether his advice is angled more for his advantage than mine. Recently papers filed under his hand were altered, not fatally, but in ways that made me doubt." "And the fifth?" Wolfe asked. Claudia shifted. She lowered her gaze for the first time. When she raised it again, her poise had thinned. "The fifth is someone I cannot afford to accuse aloud. His name is Charles Dyer. He was my companion." She let the word hang, a man of charm, great charm, and little patience for scruples. He knew my affairs, he knew my passwords, I was foolish, and he knew how to make himself indispensable. Until last month, when he ceased appearing, and then I learned certain of my letters had been intercepted, and items had been moved in my own home. A painting taken from one room to another. A key gone missing, then reappearing. Enough to suggest I was being watched, toyed with. She stopped, inhaled, and waited. Wolfe said nothing. His eyes closed as if her words were air thick enough to drown in. I looked from one to the other and felt the kind of quiet you get when the orchestra has finished tuning and the conductor hasn't raised his baton. Finally, Wolfe spoke. "Names, motives, opportunities. Acceptable, but not sufficient. You say someone tampers, someone whispers, someone displaces objects. To what end? To unsettle me, Claudia said. Quick now, to weaken me, to make me doubt myself, my memory, my grasp. And in the meantime, to siphon what is mine. You are sure, Wolfe said, that it is not only your imagination? Her eyes snapped. Mr. Wolfe, I'm not a fanciful woman. My fortune and my position are real, so are the threats. That was her first mistake, raising her voice. Wolfe doesn't enjoy passion unless it's on a plate or in a glass. But instead of cutting her off, he leaned back and let it pass, which told me he was already interested enough to forgive her. Not a good omen for me. I asked a practical question. What exactly do you want from us? Just proof one of your 5 is guilty? A nice neat package tied with a bow? She turned to me. I want certainty. I want the knowledge of who seeks to ruin me, and I want that person exposed quietly, without scandal. Can you give me that? Maybe, I said, glancing at Wolfe, depending on whether my employer is in a charitable mood. Wolfe snorted. Archie, your levity is odious. Madam, you will leave with Mr. Goodwin a full record of your accounts, correspondence, and household servants. You will also furnish addresses for these 5. I will not guarantee more than attention, but I will not accept less. Her chin dipped. You will have what you ask. She rose, gathering her gloves. I will send a courier this evening. If you require me, you may telephone directly. I trust you will preserve my privacy. Wolfe made a sound that could have meant yes, no, or past the salt. She took it for agreement and left, her perfume lingering long enough for me to open a window. When the door shut, I asked him, Well, what? Are you taking her case? He opened his eyes. Did I dismiss her? No, then I am taking her case. Pfui, must I parade my intentions? I grinned. No parade necessary. But what makes this different from the dozen other society ladies who've tried to buy your brains with champagne and caviar? He reached for a truffle from the box, held it under his nose and said, The fungus is exquisite. And the disturbance is not trivial. Someone who tampers with a woman's environment, her objects, her papers, her food, perhaps is no common thief. It suggests calculation of a more pernicious order. Sabotage, I said. Yes, and I do not abide sabotage. That was as close as Wolfe got to noble indignation. I figured it meant my workload for the next week had just tripled. I spent the evening getting the promised package from Claudia's courier files, correspondence, photographs, and Fritz nearly fainted when the delivery man added a small box of imported chocolate as a side tribute. Wolfe ignored the candy. He went straight to the papers, scanning them without comment, until the orchids upstairs began to miss their master, and he finally lumbered off for his 10 o'clock session. That left me sorting the mess until midnight. I made neat files for each suspect, jotted quick summaries, and wondered which of the 5 was crafty enough to sneak paintings around a mansion without getting noticed. By the time I finished, the truffles were still sitting on the table, fragrant and smug. The next morning, I barely had my coffee before Wolfe announced from his chair, Archie, today you will see Mr. Harold Merwin. Merwin, the partner? Indeed. Begin with him. He is clever, she says. Clever men are prone to advertise it. If he is guilty, he will betray himself not by denial, but by the flavour of his denial. Flavour, huh? I said. And if he's innocent, then his words will still serve me. I shrugged. Fine. Where do I find him? In his office on Madison Avenue, 9 o'clock. I telephoned him at 8. That was Wolfe's version of an ambush. No warning for me, no escape for the victim. I pocketed my notebook, holstered my wit, and headed out. A grey September morning waited outside, the kind that makes a man wonder why he isn't in bed. But Wolfe had spoken, Claudia had paid, and Merwin was about to meet me. And if the truffles were any indication, this case was going to be rich, complicated, and full of strange aromas. Madison Avenue isn't my idea of a good time at 9 in the morning, especially when I've had less sleep than a cabbie working double shifts. But Wolfe had decreed Harold Merwin as the first course, and when Wolfe decrees, I'm the waiter. I got there at 9:20, which, for a New Yorker, is close enough to punctuality to count as flattery. Merwin's office was in one of those sleek buildings that spend more money on the lobby marble than on the employees. A girl with lacquered nails and a headset greeted me like I was either a creditor or a process server, and when I gave my name, her expression didn't improve. But Merwin must have been expecting Wolfe's early morning call had landed because she ushered me in with the kind of reluctance usually reserved for leading sheep into slaughter. Harold Merwin stood behind a mahogany desk big enough to rent by the acre. He was in his 40s, handsome in a way that suggested mirrors had always been kind to him, and slim enough to make you wonder if he actually ate the meals his money bought. He had the kind of smile that starts before you arrive and doesn't stop until he decides what you're worth. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, extending a hand. "What an unexpected pleasure. Mr. Wolfe's envoy, no less. Sit down, sit down." I took the chair across from him. The room was polished to the hilt crystal decanters, leather-bound volumes, a painting of the Italian coast that looked expensive enough to feed a family of 6 for a year. But Merwin didn't look at any of it. He watched me like a man who measures not with a ruler but with a scalpel. "Mr. Wolfe tells me you're a clever man," I said. He seemed eager that I should meet you. "Clever?" Merwin chuckled, leaning back. "Well, I hope he doesn't hold it against me. I try to make myself useful, that's all. Claudia has complicated affairs. I help her untangle them. That's one way to put it. Another way is that you whisper to competitors." The smile froze for a fraction of a second. He looked like I'd nudged him into traffic. Then he laughed, smooth, quick, too quick. "Good heavens, is that what she's saying now? That's absurd. Claudia is, how should I phrase this? A woman who has lived in a bubble. She sees shadows where there are only trees." I jotted that down. People who call their partners delusional before the coffee is cold usually aren't angels. "So you're saying she's imagining the leaks?" "I'm saying she's nervous, and not without reason. When you've inherited the Brentano fortune, you inherit enemies. But Harold Merwin?" He spread his arms. "I am not one of them. Without me, her fabrics would still be languishing in warehouses. Without me, her vineyards would be tangled in taxes. She knows that." I let him talk, the way you let a wind-up toy run until it slows. "Funny thing, though," I said. "Someone's been moving things around in her home. Letters intercepted, paintings displaced. Do you help her untangle those too?" His eyes narrowed. "If someone is playing games with Claudia, it is not me. I have neither the time nor the temperament for childish tricks. And if she told you about those incidents, it means she trusts you more than she trusts her own people. That should tell you something." "It does," I said. "It tells me you're awfully quick to separate yourself from the scene of the crime." That got me a sharp smile. "You're good, Goodwin, but you won't find me guilty of anything more sinister than ambition. And that surely is no crime." I left him with that, though I had the distinct impression his ambition might stretch the definition. As I rode the elevator down, I considered Wolfe's prediction. A clever man reveals himself by the flavor of his denial. Merwin's denial had been spiced with contempt and garnished with superiority. Not the kind of dish Wolfe would enjoy, but definitely one worth sampling again. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk with the truffles arrayed in a neat circle, as if he were communing with them. He glanced up, saw me, and returned his gaze to the fungi. "Report?" "Merwin is clever, all right," I said, hanging my hat. Clever enough to dodge the questions without tripping, but not clever enough to keep the smug out of his voice. "He dismissed Claudia as paranoid and made sure I knew he's the linchpin of her empire." Wolfe grunted, as expected. Did he betray himself? Not with facts. With flavor, maybe. I'd call it arrogance, sprinkled with guilt. "He knows something, but whether it's theft Or just bad bookkeeping? I couldn't swear. That will suffice for now. Claudia must suspect all five, but not all five are equal. Merwin is competent, which makes him useful. A man does not jeopardize his usefulness lightly, unless he thinks he can replace it with something more profitable. Wolfe waved a hand. Archie, stop cluttering the air with speculation. We need more data. Tomorrow you will see the secretary. Evelyn Shaw. Why not the lawyer? He seems ripe for a poke. Because the secretary is nearer. If items are displaced and letters intercepted, proximity is essential. A secretary is always near. He had a point. A secretary with sticky fingers and sticky ears could do more damage than a dishonest lawyer, at least in the short term. Still, I wasn't thrilled about spending my afternoon with a woman who specialized in apologies so polished they could win awards. The next morning, I met Evelyn Shaw at a midtown cafe Claudia had recommended. She arrived early, which is one way secretaries show off. She was in her 30s, trim, with a neat suit and the kind of face that tries hard to be pleasant but carries a trace of wariness. When she saw me, she smiled with exactly the right wattage for a professional meeting. Not too bright, not too dim. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, extending a hand. "Claudia told me you might wish to speak." "That's right," I said, pulling out a chair for her. "We'll keep it simple. You've worked for Mrs. Brentano for 2 years. Yes, she's demanding, but fair, very precise. I admire her. And yet twice dismissed." The smile faltered, then returned. "Yes. Misunderstandings. I am sometimes too thorough. I read letters I shouldn't. I anticipate tasks not yet assigned. Claudia values control. She thought I was overstepping, but she also knows my value. That's why she allowed me back." "Or maybe she didn't have the heart to fire you permanently," I said. "But tell me, do you often move things in her home? Paintings, keys, letters?" Her eyes widened just enough to register the hit. "Of course not. That would be absurd." Absurd, maybe. But it happened. And if someone had access to her home, her desk, her private papers, who better than the secretary? She shook her head. "I don't enter her rooms without permission. If things are being moved, someone else is responsible." "Perhaps Charles Dyer?" "He was often at the house." I let the name hang. "And how do you know that?" She hesitated. "Because I saw him, more often than she admitted. He liked to wander, to test boundaries. Did you like him?" Another pause. "No, he made me uncomfortable. He watched people, not just Claudia, everyone. I believed her, at least in part, but her hands fidgeted with her coffee spoon, and that told me there was more she wasn't saying. By the time I wrapped up, I had a picture. Evelyn Shaw might be guilty of curiosity, but whether she was guilty of sabotage was still an open question. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe heard my account without interrupting, which was his way of saying he already knew half of it. When I finished, he leaned back and closed his eyes. Merwin dismisses her as paranoid. The secretary fears the companion. Interesting. Interesting how? They are placing blame, Archie. Each pushes suspicion elsewhere. This is what men and women do when cornered. We must watch where the blame converges. Eventually it will form a circle around the culprit. Until then, Wolfe said, reaching for another truffle. We listen, we prod, and we wait. Patience is the truest strategy, and truffles are the truest comfort. By the time Wolfe had finished savoring his truffle and declaring patience the truest strategy, I knew exactly what my next assignment was going to be. He didn't need to say it, but he did anyway, in that ponderous way that makes a simple order sound like a decree from Mount Olympus. "Tomorrow, Archie, you will see Simon Vardle." "The lawyer?" I said, just to prove I was keeping up. "Of course. A lawyer's pen is sharper than a dagger and far less honest. If documents have been altered, we must determine by whose hand." So the next morning, I found myself in a downtown office that reeked of legal dust and expensive carpet cleaner. Simon Vardell was the kind of attorney who looked like he'd been born in a three-piece suit. 60, maybe, with silver hair combed so precisely it might have been painted on, and a pair of eyes that gave nothing away unless you counted boredom. He rose to greet me, not out of enthusiasm, but because it was his policy never to risk being accused of bad manners. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, with a dry little bow. "Mr. Wolfe's assistant, please have a seat. I am at your disposal for a limited time." I sat, and I noticed the limited time. "Lawyers charge for breathing." "Thanks, I'll keep it short. Claudia Brentano tells us you handle her affairs." "I do. I have for years. She is exacting, but loyal, one of my best clients. She also tells us documents under your care were altered." "Care to explain?" His eyes flickered just once, then steadied. "Documents change, revisions, clarifications, typographical corrections. If Mrs. Brentano chooses to interpret a correction as tampering, that is her prerogative. I assure you, no document has ever left my office in a state that did not serve her best interests." "Best interests being your invoice too?" He smiled without moving his lips. "Naturally. But loyalty is not a crime, Mr. Goodwin, nor is profit." That was his theme, and he stuck to it. When I nudged about enemies, he pointed vaguely at business rivals. When I suggested betrayal, he let the silence sit until it soured. He never lost his composure, which in my line of work is usually the best evidence of guilt. But guilt of what? Skimming, or something deeper? After 40 minutes, I left with nothing concrete except the impression that if you trusted Vardell with your soul, he'd return it notarized and minus the signature. Wolfe didn't bat an eye when I gave my report. "As expected," he said, "he has the discipline of his trade. He will not betray himself until he must." That left two names on Claudia's list, cousin Anthony Brentano and Charles Dyer, the charming companion. Wolfe decided to let Anthony be my afternoon project. The cousin was in New York on business, and I caught him at a hotel suite that could have doubled as a wine cellar if you stocked it properly. Anthony Brentano looked like a man who lived off his vineyards, broad-shouldered, sun-touched, and dressed in a linen suit that had seen better pressing. He welcomed me with a firm handshake and a bottle of his own label, which he opened before I could decline. "To hospitality," he said, pouring 2 glasses. "Claudia sent you, didn't she?" "Indirectly," I said, sipping. The wine was decent. "I work for Nero Wolfe." "Ah, the great detective." And now he thinks I'm plotting against my cousin. He laughed a little too heartily. "I suppose she's told you I envy her fortune, that I feel cheated." "All true, but that doesn't make me a criminal, does it?" "It doesn't make you innocent either," I said. "Her books at the vineyard don't look so tidy." His eyes darkened. "The vineyard is mine to manage. If the numbers slip, it is because harvests slip, workers falter, storms destroy." Does she think I invent storms? Maybe not, but somebody's been playing games with her moving things, intercepting letters. Did you? He set his glass down hard enough to make it ring. "No, I don't need tricks. If I wanted Claudia's money, I'd take her to court. But I don't want her money. I want freedom from her shadow. She inherited the empire. I inherited the work. That is my grievance, not her paranoia." I believed him, almost. His resentment was real, but it had the flavor of an old wound, not a fresh cut. If he was guilty of anything, it was self-pity marinated in red wine. When I brought that report back, Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, puffing his lips. The cousin resents, the lawyer evades, the partner dismisses, the secretary fears. We are left with one companion. "Charles Dyer," I said, "the man who watches, yes. The most dangerous of them all. Charm is a weapon. When charm fails, cruelty follows." Wolfe rarely got poetic unless he was sniffing an orchid or quoting Horace. To hear him call a man dangerous meant he already suspected the center of the web. But Wolfe never pulled the trigger. without a full clip of evidence. So he sent me out again. I tracked Charles Dyer through a string of nightclubs and society mentions until I finally caught up with him in a lounge uptown, dim lighting, red leather booths, the works. Dyer was exactly as advertised, tall, trim, with a face sculpted for magazine covers and a voice smooth enough to butter toast. When I introduced myself, he smiled like I'd just made his evening. "Nero Wolfe's man," he said. "How extraordinary. Claudia must be desperate." "She prefers the word careful," I said. "She thinks you've been tampering with her life." He laughed, rich and careless. "Claudia loves her illusions. She always did. She needed me to make her feel admired. That was my role. I played it. If she now imagines I played too well, what of it?" "You had access," I said. "Her home, her papers, her keys." "Of course. She trusted me. But I never betrayed her, not in the way she thinks. Do you know what her greatest fear is? Not theft, not a scandal. It's irrelevant. She would rather imagine conspiracies than admit that she is losing control." Maybe. But the facts remain. Paintings moved, keys gone, letters missing. His smile thinned. Perhaps she moved them herself. Perhaps she misplaced them. Or perhaps someone else, Merwin, the secretary, even dear Anthony. Why assume it was me? "Because you like to watch," I said. "And because you've got nothing else to do." For the first time, his eyes hardened. "Careful, Mr. Goodwin. Charm may be a weapon, but I know other ways to fight." That was enough for me. I left before his smile could reload. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the full report, word for word. Wolfe listened, then leaned back with a sigh that shook his chair. "Each denies, each blames another, but all five are bound together by her fear." "This is not simple theft, Archie. It is a strategy. Someone is unmooring her from her own certainty." "And what's the endgame?" "Control," Wolfe said. "Always control. If you make a woman doubt her own mind, you make her pliable. That is the object here. To bend her, to claim what she cannot defend." He closed his eyes again, but I knew the case had moved from Claudia's list into Wolfe's blood. The Truffles sat on the desk, pungent and patient, as if waiting for the moment when the whole mess would unravel. And I had the sneaking suspicion the next move would not be out in the world, but right here in the brownstone. When Wolfe tells me patience is the truest strategy, it usually means I'm the one doing the running around while he stays parked in the chair, sipping beer and letting his brain marinate. But this time the patience got tested right here at home. And when I say tested, I mean somebody had the gall to tamper with Wolfe's sanctuary, the brownstone. If you don't know what that means, imagine sneaking into Fort Knox to move the furniture around and then multiply by 100. It started innocently enough. Fritz had just finished lunch, veal scallopini, delicate enough to make Wolfe grunt 3 times, and I was clearing the mail when I noticed something off about Wolfe's desk. Now, Wolfe's desk is not a place where anything gets shifted without consequence. Papers stay stacked in precise order, pens are aligned, and even the blotter has its coordinates. But one of Claudia's folders, the one with her correspondence, had been moved. Not just nudged, shifted 2 inches to the left. I hadn't touched it. Wolfe hadn't either. Fritz wouldn't dare. Which left only one explanation. Somebody had entered the office. I mentioned it as casually as I could. "Hey, boss, did you decide to start rearranging things?" Wolfe glanced up from his beer, saw the folder, and his eyes froze. That's saying something. His eyes usually move about as much as a cat in the sun. He set the glass down and said very quietly, "Archie, detail." I gave it to him, down to the inch. He listened, nodded once, and leaned back. Unacceptable, utterly unacceptable. "Which part?" I asked. "The trespass or the disrespect?" "Both." Someone has dared cross the threshold of this house unbidden. Phew. To meddle with my papers in my office is an obscenity. I'd seen Wolfe angry before, but always in ways that left him calm and immovable, like a mountain grumbling at clouds. This was different. His nostrils flared, his bulk shifted in the chair, and his hands clenched on the armrests. For a moment I half expected him to rise. He didn't, of course. He never does. But the weight in the room told me something fundamental had cracked. "Archie," he said, "lock the doors. From now until this is resolved, no one enters without my sanction. Not even Fritz, unless he carries a tray." "Fine," I said, though my blood was running quicker. "But how'd they get in? You'd have heard it." "I'd have heard it." "That is precisely what alarms me." They entered silently. Which means foreknowledge, which means surveillance. The idea that someone had slipped into the brownstone, past both of us, and left only a displaced folder was enough to put a shiver in my spine. It wasn't just mischief, it was a message. Claudia had complained of exactly that small, deliberate trespasses meant to unseat her certainty. And now the same disease had spread to Wolfe's temple. I checked the locks, the windows, the back door, and found nothing tampered. Either someone had picked their way in with the skill of a safecracker, or worse, someone had access. The only other possibility was imagination, but I knew I hadn't moved that folder, and Wolfe sure as hell hadn't either. Which meant we had an intruder, invisible but very real. Wolfe called Saul Panzer. He never does that lightly. Saul is the best freelance sleuth in the city, maybe the country, and when Wolfe hires him, it means the game has shifted into higher stakes. Saul arrived that evening, quiet as usual, wearing a hat that looked like it had seen everything twice. He heard us out, examined the office, and didn't smile once. "Could have been anyone with a key," Saul said finally. "But your locks don't show where, no scratches. If they picked them, they did it better than 99 out of 100. "And the 100th?" I asked. Saul shrugged. "The 100th doesn't exist. Except maybe now." Wolfe harumphed. "So, Saul, you will watch. Outside, discreet. Note to all who approach. If anyone loiters, you will know. If anyone returns, you will intercept." Saul nodded. "What am I looking for?" "A phantom," Wolfe said. "One that moves objects an inch at a time." Observe Claudia's circle. One of them has dared to extend their experiment to me. Saul left with instructions to keep an eye on Claudia's suspects as well as our own doorstep. That night I barely slept. The idea that some invisible hand could slip into the brownstone and rearrange our world made me itch like poison ivy. The next day Claudia herself phoned. Wolfe let me take it, but he sat there listening. Her voice was strained. "Mr. Goodwin, something new has happened. A file from my desk has vanished. When it reappeared this morning, 2 pages were missing." "Which file?" "Correspondence with my vineyard managers. Letters that mention discrepancies. Whoever removed them knew exactly what to take." I relayed this to Wolfe, who closed his eyes. "It deepens," he said. "First her, now me. They mean to demonstrate control. They want us to know. Then what?" I asked. "We sit and wait for them to rearrange your orchids." He flinched, just slightly, but enough. His orchids are his holy relics. If someone touched them, war would be declared. "Archie," he said, "it is time to tighten the circle. Bring Merwin here. Tomorrow evening. Tell him it is urgent. Just Merwin, for now. His cleverness requires testing under pressure. We will see whether he cracks when confronted with the trespass." So I called Merwin's office and set it up. He didn't sound thrilled, but Wolfe's name works like a magnet on the ambitious. The appointment was made. Meanwhile, Saul reported Anthony had returned to his vineyard. Evelyn Shaw kept to her apartment. Vardell shuffled between clients, and Charles Dyer was seen slipping into a hotel lobby with a woman, not Claudia. Saul's comment was dry charm as advertised. None of it proved anything, but the trespass was proof enough that the enemy was near, watching, and confident. Too confident. Wolfe sat brooding through dinner, ignoring Fritz's perfectly braised duck. He let me handle the small talk, while his brain churned like a furnace behind those heavy lids. Later that night, I caught him staring at the folder again as if it were a corpse in the parlour. He muttered something Latin, probably, and then he looked at me. Archie. You understand now why this cannot be tolerated. I do, I said, but I'd also like to understand who the hell we're up against. You will, Wolfe said, soon. But first, we must bait the hook. And that was how the brownstone, which had always been a fortress, became a battlefield. The enemy had crept inside, touched Wolfe's papers, and left without a sound. They'd rattled Claudia, and now they'd rattled him. Which meant the game had officially changed, and when the game changes for Nero Wolfe, somebody is bound to lose, and it won't be him. The night after we discovered the trespass, Wolfe set a rhythm that even Fritz could sense was more than habit. He sat heavier in his chair, spoke less, and when he did, his words were stripped to bone. Fritz whispered to me in the kitchen that he felt eyes on him while he cooked, which for a man like Fritz, who usually thinks of little beyond sauce consistency, was a sign the brownstone had soaked up the tension. Saul's watch outside didn't help much either. He phoned in at midnight to report nothing unusual, but nothing felt thicker than something. Whoever had slipped in once might do it again, and this time I half expected to find a truffle stuffed in my typewriter. The following evening, as Wolfe had ordered, Harold Merwin arrived. He came briskly, in a tailored suit that smelled faintly of tobacco and ego, and carried himself like a man who thought a private audience with Nero Wolfe was the same as being summoned to the throne. I ushered him into the office. Wolfe didn't stand, of course, but his eyes tracked Merwin the way a hawk tracks a rabbit. "Mr. Merwin," Wolfe said, his voice low. "Thank you for coming." Merwin smiled, glanced at me, then back at Wolfe. "It sounded urgent, Mr. Wolfe. I came as soon as my schedule permitted." "Indeed, sit." Wolfe gestured to the red chair. Merwin settled in, crossing one leg neatly over the other, and leaned back as though preparing to spar. Wolfe waited, silent. He let the air thicken. I've seen it 100 times. The pause becomes a wait, and before long the guest starts shifting. Merwin lasted longer than most, but when Wolfe finally spoke, his words landed like stones in a pond. "Someone has trespassed here, into my house, into this room. They displaced papers. They touched what was mine. You understand?" Merwin's smile faltered just for a second. "I'm sorry to hear that, but what has that to do with me? Everything. You are within the circle. Claudia Brentano entrusted you. If she is disturbed, you are disturbed. And now I am disturbed. That makes us adversaries, Mr. Merwin, unless you prove otherwise." Merwin leaned forward, his confidence trying to steady itself. "With respect, Mr. Wolfe, I have nothing to do with your papers. I wouldn't dare. My life is complicated enough managing Claudia's empire." "Complicated enough," Wolfe said, "to leak whispers to rivals?" That got him. His eyes flashed and his jaw tightened before he smoothed it over. "So Claudia claims. Nonsense. She is paranoid. I support her. I always have." "Support?" Wolfe's lips curled. "You think her a fool. You dismiss her suspicions as fancy. That is not supported. That is erosion. You corrode her from within." I watched Merwin bristle. The man who had greeted me in his office with charm was gone. What sat in the red chair was stripped of polish, like steel under paint. "If you've brought me here to accuse me, then let me be plain. I have enemies of my own, competitors who would benefit from Claudia's downfall, but I am not one of them." "You protest too much," Wolfe murmured, "and you arrive too quickly when called. That is vanity. Useful. You may go." Merwin rose, stiff but still trying to salvage dignity. "If you intend to smear me, you'll have nothing to show for it." "Good evening." I saw him out, and when I came back, Wolfe hadn't moved. His eyes were shut, fingers steepled. "Archie," he said, "what did you observe?" "That he's a cocky bastard who cracked when you pushed him. He hates Claudia more than he admits, and he wanted us to see his outrage, yes, but he did not betray himself with detail, not yet. The trespass unsettled him." "That is useful. What next?" I asked. "Pressure," Wolfe said. "We increased the pressure, and that's what happened." Over the next 2 days, Saul shadowed Evelyn Shaw and Vardell. He reported Evelyn meeting with a man who matched Dyer's description outside a bookstore, 10 minutes of tense conversation before they separated. Vardell, meanwhile, had a late-night meeting with someone he kept hidden in his office, blinds drawn, lights dimmed. Saul couldn't identify the visitor, but he noted the car was a silver coupe registered to one of Claudia's competitors in the textile market. When I relayed that to Wolfe, he grunted like a man tasting a soup that was finally starting to thicken. "So, Vardell has ties outside. The secretary speaks with the companion, the cousin sulks in his vineyard, and the partner resents. It is a web of overlapping betrayals." "Yeah, but which one moved your papers?" I asked. "None," Wolfe said, "and all. The hand that trespassed here meant not to steal, but to warn. A demonstration, a declaration of reach. Pfui!" That night, something new happened. Saul phoned in at 11 to say a man had been loitering across the street for an hour, smoking, watching the brownstone. Saul approached. The man fled, ducked into a cab, and was gone before Saul could catch the plate. But Saul swore he recognized the gate. "Charles Dyer," he said. "I'd bet on it." When I told Wolfe, he made a sound deep in his throat. "So, he watches us as he watches her. Obscene, but expected." By then, Claudia was calling daily, sometimes twice. Her voice was increasingly brittle. Another key misplaced, another file shifted. She insisted she was losing control. I could hear the panic creeping in, and Wolfe heard it too. He finally told me, "Archie, enough. Bring them all here, all 5, tomorrow night. The time for patience has ended." It wasn't often Wolfe set a deadline. When he did, it meant his mind had reached its conclusion, and all that was left was the theatre of proof. But the theatre still needed rehearsals. He spent the evening dictating questions for each suspect, his voice crisp, methodical. I wrote them down, though I knew half of them wouldn't make sense until he fired them in sequence like bullets. He didn't tell me the answer yet, and never does, but I could see the gears turning, the way his eyes flicked toward Claudia's folder like it was the Rosetta Stone. Fritz, sensing the storm, made preparations as though he were cooking for an army. Saul set his watch schedule tighter. I oiled my revolver, not because I expected bullets, but because in this line of work pressure makes people unpredictable, and the brownstone, once violated, felt less like a fortress and more like a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. By the time I turned in, Wolfe was still at his desk, staring at the circle of Truffles as if they were suspects of their own. He muttered something, maybe Latin, maybe just irritation, and I realized the trespasser had made a mistake. They'd rattled Claudia, yes, but they'd also rattled Nero Wolfe. And if there's one thing you don't do, it's rattle Wolfe in his own house. He would make them pay, not with fists or pistols, but with words so sharp they'd bleed in silence. Tomorrow night the suspects will gather here, and Wolfe would spring the trap. When Wolfe says bring them all here, it isn't a suggestion. It's a royal command, and I'm the herald who has to make sure the dukes, pretenders, and would-be usurpers show up on time. So the morning after Merwin's visit, I started dialing. Vardell first. He was polished as always, tried to squeeze me for details, but when I invoked Wolfe's name urgently, he folded. Evelyn Shaw was more skittish, asked twice if Claudia would be present, and only agreed when I assured her she wouldn't be ambushed by her employer. Anthony Brentano groaned about vineyard business, but I reminded him he had more to lose by refusing. And Charles Dyrwell, he laughed, smooth and rich, and said he wouldn't miss it for the world. Which made me wonder what he thought he'd gain by showing up. By noon, the invitations were set. All 5 suspects would appear the next evening in Wolfe's office. That gave us 24 hours to prepare, which in Wolfe's world means he did nothing visible, and I did everything else. Fritz fussed in the kitchen about whether to serve canapes or coffee. Wolfe growled that food would distract from the business at hand, and Fritz retreated, wounded but obedient. Saul kept his vigil outside, reporting no further loiterers, though he admitted Dyer had been seen again, watching Claudia's townhouse this time. I spent the day combing through Claudia's documents, checking for details Wolfe might demand at a moment's notice, dates, signatures, odd phrases in letters I had them ready. Wolfe never tells me which bit of data will matter until he springs it, so my only defense is to have all of it on the tip of my tongue. By dinner, I was as wired as a telegraph pole. Wolfe, on the other hand, dined like a man with eternity to spare. Fritz served pheasant under glass. Wolfe ate slowly, deliberately, and said nothing. When he finally pushed his plate back, he looked at me and said, "You are uneasy?" "No kidding," I said. "We've got 5 people walking in here tomorrow, each of them ready to lie through their teeth. And one of them managed to slip in already without leaving footprints. If that doesn't make me uneasy, I ought to retire." "Phooey, you exaggerate. We will be safe." "You sound confident." "I am," Wolfe said, "because the trespasser has already lost." That was a new angle. "Lost?" "He broke into your house. He rattled Claudia. Seems like he's winning." "He revealed himself," Wolfe said. "Subtlety requires invisibility. The moment he touched my desk, he ceased to be subtle. He showed his hand. Tomorrow I will show him the consequences." He closed his eyes and leaned back, which meant the conversation was over. I stayed restless, but Wolfe had that immovable calm that made you believe he'd already solved the case and was just waiting for the paperwork. I wished he'd clue me in, but that's not how he plays. He hoards his conclusions like Fritz hoards spices. The next day I crawled. I spent most of it making sure the office was stage ready. Wolfe's desk was cleared except for the truffle box and Claudia's folder, positioned like sacred relics. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle, facing Wolfe's throne. I checked the locks twice, drew the curtains, and polished my notebook. Fritz asked if he should provide coffee after all, and Wolfe finally conceded black, unsweetened, nothing more. That was as far as hospitality went. By late afternoon, Wolfe summoned me, Archie. The order is essential. Merwin first, then the secretary, then Vardel, then the cousin, and finally Dyer. Why that order? Because it will irritate them, Wolfe said. Each in turn will grow impatient. Impatience breeds indiscretion. The companion, last, will feel the full weight of accumulated suspicion. I grinned. So it's theatre after all. Justice is always theatre, Wolfe said. Only the script differs. At 7 o'clock sharp, Harold Merwin arrived, immaculate and tense. I showed him in, pointed him to a chair, and ignored his demand to know what this was about. Evelyn Shaw came next, lips tight, eyes darting. She took the farthest seat. Vardel strolled in 10 minutes later, apologizing for another client, which earned him a glare from Wolfe. Anthony Brentano arrived grumbling about travel, but the wine on his breath betrayed an afternoon spent in less noble pursuits. Finally, Charles Dyer swept in at 7:30, perfectly composed, greeting each of the others with the kind of charm that makes enemies smile through their teeth. When all were seated, Wolfe opened his eyes. He didn't move, didn't raise his voice, but the silence he imposed was heavier than iron. "You wonder why you are here?" he said. "The reason is simple. One of you has trespassed. One of you has sought to unseat Claudia Brentano by tampering not with her fortune, but with her certainty. One of you has extended this insult to me, and tonight you will betray yourself." The words landed. Evelyn shifted. Anthony scowled. Vardell smoothed his tie. Merwin leaned back with a smirk, and Dyer, damn him, smiled as if Wolfe were flattering him. Wolfe gestured to me. "Archie, begin." That was my cue to read the questions Wolfe had dictated one by one in his chosen order. Each suspect took their turn in the spotlight, with Wolfe watching, silent, catching every twitch and pause. I fired at Merwin first, his dealings with rivals, his view of Claudia's competence, his alibi for the nights in question. He parried, cocky but rattled, especially when Wolfe interrupted once to ask, "Did you enjoy displacing my folder, Mr. Merwin?" The silence that followed nearly suffocated the room. Merwin denied it, too fast, and Wolfe let him stew. Next, Evelyn Shaw. I asked about her access, her conversations with Dyer, her reasons for returning after dismissal. She stammered, tried to paint herself as loyal, but when I mentioned Dyer, her eyes darted his way before she could stop them. Wolfe's fingers twitched, the closest he gets to applause. Vardell followed, calm as granite. He denied altering documents with any motive beyond precision, denied clandestine meetings. But Saul's note about the silver coupe gave me ammunition, and when I pressed, his composure cracked just enough to reveal a bead of sweat at his temple. Wolfe pounced with a single phrase. "Truth is never so neat, Mr. Vardell." Vardell licked his lips but said nothing. Anthony Brentano was easier. He ranted about his cousin, about his grievances, about storms and labour costs. Wolfe let him talk himself hoarse, then cut him off with one word: irrelevant. Anthony shut up like someone had slapped him. Finally, Dyer. I aimed my questions, but he was ready. He deflected, he charmed, he leaned on Claudia's supposed paranoia. When I asked about watching her townhouse, he smiled and said, "If I watched, it was with admiration." Wolfe's lips curled in contempt. By the end, the room was taut as wire. Wolfe let the silence stretch longer and longer, until even Dyer's smile faltered. Then he said, "You may all go. Tomorrow we will meet again, but tonight you will reflect on what you have revealed." There was protest, muttering, outrage, but Wolfe didn't move. He closed his eyes. That was dismissal. I ushered them out one by one, noting the glares, the whispers, the clenched jaws. Dyer was last. He lingered in the doorway and said softly, "Tell Wolfe he underestimates me." Then he was gone. When I returned, Wolfe was still in his chair, eyes shut, lips pursed. "Archie," he said, "we are close. Tomorrow the truth will break. Tonight we watched." "Watch what?" "Watch who cannot bear the weight of exposure. They will act. And when they do, we will have them." It was past midnight when I finally turned in, but I knew sleep wouldn't come easy. The brownstone had been disturbed once. If Wolfe was right, the trespasser wasn't done. And the next move could be the one that forced everything into the open. If you've never seen 5 suspects file into Wolfe's office, you've missed a rare form of theatre. The air tightens, the furniture feels closer, and Wolfe himself becomes the stage. He sits behind his desk like a boulder that has decided to pass judgment on the river. The evening after the preliminary grilling, they returned, Merwin sharp as a dagger, Evelyn pale as paper, Vardell armoured in calm, Anthony fuming, and Dyer carrying his smile like a sword. Claudia Brentano herself was absent by Wolfe's order, but her presence hung over the room as if she were watching from the shadows. The arrangement was the same as before, but this time Wolfe's desk held only 2 things: the truffles in their box and Claudia's folder, placed exactly where it had been moved. That wasn't a coincidence. It was bait. I could see it in the way Wolfe let his gaze rest on the folder now and then, like a cat pretending to nap in front of a mouse hole. When everyone was seated, Wolfe exhaled heavily. "You know why you are here." Someone among you has engaged in a campaign not of theft, but of corrosion, displacing, intercepting, altering. Claudia Brentano's stability was the target. When she doubted herself, she would become dependent. That was the plan. And the one who executed it grew bold enough to step into this house, to touch what is mine. That was his mistake. No one moved. Even Anthony, who usually couldn't resist a mutter, stayed still. Wolfe's eyes passed over them one by one, weighing them like fruit at a market. Then he turned to me. "Archie, read." I read from Claudia's correspondence, the section where vineyard reports had been altered. Wolfe asked Vardell to explain why the final filing differed from the draft. Vardell's voice was steady. I corrected the figures. "A typist's error, nothing more." "An error," Wolfe repeated, "one that made Claudia doubt herself." Curious that. Vardell adjusted his cuffs but didn't falter. Wolfe let it drop, moving to Evelyn. I asked her to describe her duties, how often she had access to Claudia's private desk. She admitted it was daily, though she swore she touched only what she was instructed. Wolfe asked softly, and yet twice dismissed for overstepping. "Why tolerated?" Evelyn's lips trembled. "Because she knew I was loyal. Because I begged her forgiveness." Her eyes flicked to Dyer again, and Wolfe noted it with a grunt. Merwin's turn came. I read questions about his conversations with competitors. He scoffed. "Everyone talks, Mr. Wolfe. In business, rumors are currency. If Claudia chooses to believe I betray her, that's her choice. But without me, her fortune would collapse." "Without you," Wolfe murmured, "it might survive more cleanly." Merwin bristled, but held his tongue. Anthony was next. I asked about the missing file Claudia had mentioned. He swore he knew nothing. Wolfe asked, "Would you prefer her fortune stripped so you might inherit?" Anthony slammed his fist on his knee. "I don't want her money, I want respect." His face flushed red as the wine he drank. Wolfe grunted again, unimpressed. Finally, Charles Dyer. I asked about his presence outside the brownstone, his meetings with Evelyn, his charm that seemed to wander wherever Claudia's doubts did. He smiled, unbothered. "I was curious, Mr. Goodwin. Watching is not a crime. And speaking with Evelyn, that was a coincidence. We crossed paths, nothing more." "Coincidence," Wolfe echoed. "How convenient." Wolfe let the silence stretch. The room felt smaller by the second. He opened his eyes fully and said, "Each of you had a motive. Each of you had an opportunity, but only one of you had the temperament for this game." Claudia was not to be robbed, not at once, but weakened, slowly. Her memory contradicted, her objects moved, her files tampered. Such methods require more than greed. They require cruelty, cold amusement, the satisfaction of watching another unravel. That is the hallmark of Charles Dyer. All eyes turned to him. Dyer didn't flinch. He even laughed, soft and low. "Amusing, Mr. Wolfe, very amusing, but words are not proof. No?" Wolfe's brows lifted. "Proof is in pattern. When Evelyn feared you, when Merwin dismissed Claudia's mind, when Vardell's filings undermined her confidence, when Anthony's resentment hung like smoke. These were diversions. But you, Mr. Dyer, you cultivated them. You intercepted letters because you were in her house. You moved paintings because you knew she would notice. And when that ceased to satisfy you, you dared to enter here. You touched my desk because you wanted me unsettled. You wanted me to feel what she felt." Dyer's smile flickered just for a heartbeat before he recovered. "Extraordinary. You claim I broke into your house, that I, of all people, would risk prison for such a petty thrill? Absurd, absurd." Wolfe's voice sharpened. "Then tell me why, when you sat here last night, your eyes returned 3 times to that folder exactly where it had been displaced." None of the others looked, only you. You knew it was not in its place. You had seen it moved because you moved it. The silence that followed was absolute. I even felt the chill. Dyer's hand twitched on the arm of his chair, but he forced it still. Circumstantial, he said finally. You read meaning into glances. Wolfe shook his head. Not meaning, memory. You remembered where it had been, and you betrayed yourself. Dyer stood, his charm cracking, anger bleeding through. This is a farce. You have nothing. Wolfe didn't move. On the contrary, I have everything. I have your nature. You delight in watching others falter. Claudia, Evelyn, even me. You thought yourself invisible, but invisibility ends the moment you seek to be noticed. You wanted us to know. That is why you failed. Dyer's eyes swept the room, daring someone to defend him. None did. Evelyn looked down, ashamed. Merwin sneered. Anthony muttered something about leeches. Vardell stayed still, calculating, and in that tableau, Dyer's smile finally slipped for good. He turned on his heel and strode to the door, but I was faster. I blocked him. You'll stay put, I said, at least until Claudia decides what she wants done. Wolfe sighed, heavy and final. Archie, escort him to the front room. Call Claudia. She deserves to hear her tormentor unmasked. The rest may leave. Their follies are many, but not of this stripe. One by one they filed out, silence clinging to them like smoke. When the door closed behind the last of them, Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes, and said, "The game is over. The fungus may be enjoyed without offence." That was his version of triumph. For me, it meant paperwork, phone calls, and keeping an eye on Dyer until Claudia arrived. But I couldn't argue with the result. Wolfe had pulled the string, and the web collapsed exactly as he said it would. Dyer had wanted control, but in the end he'd lost it the moment he touched what was sacred to Wolfe, and Wolfe never forgives trespass. Dyer didn't take being cornered the way some men do. He didn't collapse or bluster until he drowned in his own noise. He paced back and forth across the front room, where I kept him parked while Wolfe waited for Claudia. His charm, that polished veneer that had carried him through cocktail parties and late-night liaisons, was still there. But it had cracks now, hairline fractures spreading under pressure. He'd stop at the window, glance at the street, then turn sharply as if he had somewhere else to be, anywhere else but under Wolfe's roof. "You know," he said to me, flashing half a smile, "this is a game, a clever one. Wolfe thinks he's won, but what has he really? Circumstance." A folder moved, a glance, hardly enough to convict a man. "Maybe not in court," I said, "but you should know by now Wolfe doesn't play for the court. He plays for certainty. Once he's got that, the rest is just paperwork." He laughed, a little too loudly. "Certainty? Don't make me laugh. Certainty is an illusion. Ask Claudia. She can't tell her own memory from a shadow anymore." "Funny," I said. "You don't sound like a man who thinks he's walking out of here clean." His eyes sharpened. "And you don't sound like a man who knows what he's holding. You think Claudia will press charges against me? She doesn't have the stomach for scandal. She'll hush this up the way she hushes everything, and I'll walk." I didn't answer because just then the doorbell rang. Fritz admitted Claudia herself, wrapped in another coat that probably cost more than my yearly pay. She swept into the front room, her eyes immediately fixing on Dyer. He straightened, smiled, but this time his charm bounced off her like rain on stone. "Charles," she said, and the single word carried enough steel to cut. "So it is you?" He spread his hands. "Claudia, darling, listen to me." "No," she snapped. "I have listened too long. Mr. Wolfe has explained. It fits. Every doubt, every whisper, everything out of place. You fed my fears. You made me believe I was losing my mind." He tried to close the gap between them, but I stepped in, blocking him. His smile twisted, but he kept the performance going. Claudia, I only wanted you to depend on me, that's all. To know you needed me. Is that a crime? To be indispensable? Her face hardened. It is a cruelty. You betrayed trust, not for money, not even for power, but for amusement. To watch me unravel. I despise you. That one hit him. The smile faltered, and for a moment he looked less like the polished companion and more like a boy caught in a lie. But then he rallied, turning to me. So what now? You keep me here until she faints from drama? Or does Wolfe want me to beg? You'll wait, I said, until Wolfe is ready. That didn't take long. Fritz came in to announce Wolfe wanted us all back in the office. Dyer sneered but followed, Claudia right behind him, shoulders squared like a woman reclaiming something stolen. When we entered, Wolfe hadn't moved, but his presence had thickened the air again. He inclined his head to Claudia. Madam, you wished for certainty. There it sits before you. She nodded, eyes fixed on.
Dyer, Wolfe continued, his voice a steady drumbeat. Mr. Dyer sought to reduce you by increments. Not to destroy you outright, but to corrode you slowly. He intercepted letters to make you doubt your recollection. He displaced paintings and keys to make you doubt your senses. He enlisted silence from those around you by exploiting their weaknesses, Merwin's arrogance, Vardell's self-interest, Anthony's resentment, Evelyn's fear. Each played a part, but unknowingly. Only Dyer orchestrated. Merwin, still lingering in the room, stiffened. I denied, Foy, Wolfe cut him off. You are vain, not malicious. Your betrayal was incidental. Vardell, you bent too easily toward rivals, but your motive was profit, not sabotage. Anthony, your resentment blinded you, but you lacked subtlety. Evelyn, your timidity was exploited, not created. Only Dyer fits the pattern. Evelyn's head bowed. Anthony muttered something sour, but said no more. Vardell pursed his lips. Merwin smouldered, but he didn't speak again. And Dyer stood in the centre, his smile gone now, his eyes narrowed like a cornered cat. Charles Dyer, Wolfe intoned, you are guilty not of theft, not of murder, but of treachery, intellectual treachery. You amused yourself with a woman's stability. You sought to enthrone yourself by eroding hers. That is your crime. Dyer sneered. A crime without law. What will you do? Call the police? Tell them I moved a painting? No, Wolfe said. The law may not touch you, but society will. And Claudia holds the means. She will not whisper now, she will speak. Claudia's eyes gleamed with cold fire. I will tell every paper, every partner, every sockled friend. You are poisonous, Charles. I will see to it that no circle welcomes you again. Dyer's mask cracked then. The charm slipped fully, and beneath it was fury. You'll regret this, he spat. All of you. I stepped closer, ready for him to try something foolish. Wolfe raised a hand. No violence, Archie. He is already undone. Dyer glared at Wolfe, but there was no victory left in him. He turned and strode out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the brownstone like the crack of a gavel. Silence followed. Claudia exhaled slowly, then sank into the red chair as if her strength had fled with him. Mr. Wolfe, she said softly, I owe you everything. You have given me back my mind. Wolfe inclined his head. No, madam, you had your mind. He sought to cloud it. I merely cleared the air. She looked at him with gratitude and something like awe, then rose. I will see myself out. Thank you. She glanced at me, and for once her eyes were not assessing, but sincere. Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. And she left, her steps steadier than when she had first entered days ago. The others followed, one by one, each subdued in their own way. Merwin tight-lipped, Vardell unreadable, Anthony brooding, Evelyn still pale but lighter, as if released. When the door finally shut, Wolfe sighed, long and deep, as if
exhaling the weight of the entire affair. "Archie," he said, "bring me beer." I fetched it, opened it, and watched him drink. His eyes closed, his bulk settled deeper into the chair, and at last he spoke. "Human folly, Archie, is the most abundant resource on earth, more plentiful than coal, more enduring than stone, and yet men waste it for trifles. That man wasted it for amusement." "Fore," I said. "At least he won't be amusing himself in Claudia's house any more." "No," Wolfe said, "nor in mine." That was the end of it. Fritz served dinner duck again with a sauce that finally earned Wolfe's approval. The truffles were shaved onto his plate, and for the first time in days he ate without a shadow hanging over him. The brownstone was quiet again, as it should be. I sat back watching him and thought that once more the world had tried to rattle Nero Wolfe. And once more the world had lost. The days after Dyer's exposure felt like a slow settling of dust after a collapse. Claudia didn't call again, but her silence wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the quiet of a woman who had chosen to hold her head high in public and let her tormentor sink. Saul stopped his watch at Wolfe's order, satisfied no one was lurking in shadows anymore. Fritz reclaimed the kitchen from paranoia and began humming again, which in this house is as good as church bells announcing peace. Only Wolfe showed no change. He was exactly as before, as if Dyer had never breathed the same air. That, I knew, was his way of restoring the sanctity of the brownstone by refusing to acknowledge it had ever truly been disturbed. For me, it wasn't so simple. I still caught myself glancing at Wolfe's desk, half expecting to see a folder shifted, a pen out of line. Nothing moved. Everything remained exactly as Wolfe demanded. But I couldn't shake the image of Dyer standing in that room, smug, confident, and convinced he was untouchable. That kind of arrogance doesn't vanish overnight, even if Claudia had promised to salt the ground behind him. I mentioned it once, over breakfast. He could reinvent himself, you know, different name, different crowd. Men like him always find new doors. Wolfe snorted. Let him. Reinvention requires a stage. Society is his only stage, and Claudia will close the curtain. Without her circle, he will wither. He will not dare touch mine again. You sound sure? I am. He dipped his spoon into his eggs and continued eating. End of conversation. And maybe he was right. If I'd learned anything, it was that Dyer's greatest weapon wasn't muscle or money, it was presence, the ability to worm his way into drawing rooms and make people doubt themselves. Wolfe had denied him that. Claudia would finish the job. The orchids upstairs thrived, oblivious to human folly. Wolfe spent longer in the plant rooms that week, maybe to reassert his sense of order. I tagged along once, more out of boredom than interest, and listened while he lectured about the delicate balance of humidity. If you disturb it, he said, lifting a sprayer, they falter. A day, two, perhaps more, but the decline is inevitable. They are strong, yet fragile. Do you understand? He meant Dyer, of course, though he'd never admit it outright. I nodded anyway, because it's easier than arguing with orchids. By Friday, Claudia's circle had scattered. Merwin sent a note through his office, formal and brittle, disclaiming all association with Dyer. Vardell telephoned, assuring Wolfe his firm's loyalty and asking if Claudia intended legal action. Wolfe grunted into the receiver and hung up. Anthony disappeared back to Piedmont, licking his wounds. Evelyn Shaw wrote a letter, handwritten and shaky, thanking Wolfe for vindicating her loyalty. Wolfe let me read it, then dropped it in the wastebasket without a comment. He doesn't show gratitude. That's my department. As for Claudia, she had already begun her campaign. Saul reported that Dyer's name was turning sour among the people who mattered, subtle whispers, but steady. By the end of the month, he'd be as welcome in Manhattan drawing rooms as a leper at a garden party. It was Justice Wolfe's way, not with gavel or badge, but with words and exposure, the kind that rots a man's reputation faster than time. One evening, a week after the showdown, I found Wolfe at his desk, not with a book or the Gazette, but with his eyes closed, fingers resting lightly on the arms of his chair. He looked almost peaceful. I asked, "What's on your mind?" He opened one eye. "Nothing. Come on, you don't sit like that unless you're running something through the mill." "Foy, if I am, it is no concern of yours," which means it's exactly my concern. "Spill," he sighed. "Very well." I was reflecting that Claudia Brentano's torment was, in essence, trivial. No murder, no theft of consequence. Yet it was also profound. A woman's sanity, Archie, is a fragile possession. To play with it for amusement is more obscene than robbery. I was considering whether men will ever cease to amuse themselves at the expense of others' stability. "And your answer?" "My answer," Wolfe said, closing his eyes again, "is no. They will not. But occasionally one may be corrected. It wasn't philosophy I could argue with." I poured myself a drink, sat back, and thought about the strange shape of justice. Claudia had her certainty returned, Dyer had been exposed, and Wolfe had his peace restored. There'd be no headlines, no jury, no formal verdict. Just a man broken by the truth and a woman who no longer doubted her own mind. That was enough, Wolfe thought. Maybe it was. Dinner that night was lamb with rosemary, Fritz's triumph. Wolfe ate heavily, drank beer, and finally pronounced the sauce adequate. Fritz nearly wept with pride. When the plates were cleared, Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closed, and said, "Archie." "Yeah, this house. It is inviolable. Remember that. It is my fortress, and it will remain so, provided we guard it not only from thieves, but from triflers who seek to mock its order. Do you understand?" I grinned. "Sure, no triflers allowed. I'll put a sign on the door." "Your levity is odious," he muttered, but his lips twitched, and I knew he'd heard the quip, even if he wouldn't admit to enjoying it. He reached for another bottle of beer. The brownstone exhaled. Dinner was done. The world outside could play its games, but here, within these walls, order was restored. And that was the end of the trouble with Truffles.